My name is Mary Newberger, and I am the chair of the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies and the director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. And I'm also a professor of history here at UT Austin. It's my honor to be introducing our speakers tonight. But before I do that, I wanted to thank the HRC for hosting this event, and also Connect for doing all the work behind the scenes to make this happen. Thank you very much. Yeah. I also want to thank our sponsors, one of which is the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies, also the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and the Center for European Studies. So thank you for the funding from those three, two of which I run, but okay. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our guest and also our own Steve Holscher, who will be speaking with our guest tonight. We're going to have a conversation, so I'm very excited for this. Our special guest is Chris Niedenthal, who's a British-Polish photographer and photojournalist who's best known for visually documenting pivotal moments in East European history, including the rise of Solidarity, the imposition of martial law in Poland, and the fall of the Berlin Wall. Throughout his 50-year career, Niedenthal was primarily a freelance photographer for outlets such as Newsweek, Time, Forbes, Stern, and Der Spiegel. He covered events behind the Iron Curtain in the 1980s and traveled to China with Polish President Lech Walesa during the Tiananmen Square protests. His photo portrait of Hungarian communist leader János Kádár appeared on the cover of Time magazine's international edition and won a prestigious World Press Photo Award. More recently, Niedenthal completed a project on children with intellectual disabilities, which resulted in the exhibition Taboo, The Portraits of the Unportrayed. In addition, he created the exhibition Sąsiedka, I know I'm pronouncing that wrong, or Neighbor, with the prominent Polish photographer Tadeusz Rolki, on the complex relationship between Poles and Jews in Polish history and today. Niedenthal currently has an exhibition of his photographs out at Round Rock at the Public Library, which will be there until November 20th. So if you haven't visited that already, I hope you can make it out there. Tonight, he will be speaking with our own Dr. Steve Holscher, who's Associate Dean for Academic Affairs in the College of Liberal Arts, the Stiles Professor of American Studies and Geography, and the Faculty Curator of Photography here at the Harry Ransom Center. He completed his PhD in Geography at the University of Wisconsin and was a senior Fulbright professor at the University of Bonn in 2003 and 2004. Professor Holscher's research interests include the history of photography, race and racism, North American and European urbanism, social constructions of space and place, and cultural memory. His books include Reading Magnum, which was recognized as the 2013 Photo Book of the Year by American Photo Magazine, Picturing Indians, which is winner of the 2009 Wisconsin Historical Society Book Award of Merit, and Heritage on Stage. And he also is a co-editor of a book called Textures of Place, so he has lots of publications. He's published more than 60 book chapters, articles, and essays, and his exhibition, Visualizing the Environment, Ansel Adams and His Legacy, is now on display here at the Harry Ransom Center through February of 2025. So I hope you get a chance to see that as well. So I would like our speakers to come out now, and we can get this show started. We're going to start with Chris Niedenthal speaking for about 20 minutes, followed by a conversation with Steve Holscher, and then we'll have Q&A at the end.
Do I have to go there? Yeah. Okay. I have my camera just in case. I'm sorry, but I don't know if you understand me because I speak English. Just a minor point there. Yeah, what can we say? I'm a very lucky guy, actually, because I never thought I'd become a big weekly news magazine photographer. I was just a guy in London and England doing silly picture stories or features. And I'm of Polish descent, which means I was interested in Poland. And I decided, I used to come there on holiday many times, or vacation for many years. And I just sank into Poland, actually. In '73, when I finished my studies in London, I studied photography at the London College of Printing. I decided to come to Poland just for a few months to see what it's like not being on vacation, because it's a different story being on holiday and living the way the people live. I knew very well it was a bad time to go, because this was the '70s, the bad days of communism. But I was just interested in, basically, I was not interested in politics. I didn't know much about politics. I had no outlets for it. I had no contacts in any world media. So I just wanted to do feature stories like I did in London, or just travel around Poland and see what daily life was like in those days, which was actually very good. I'm always jealous of my older friends in Poland, old photographers who were around there in the 50s and 60s, because that's when communism was really bad, but very photogenic. Everything was, was very absurd and abstract. I just managed the 70s. That was maybe the late 60s, early 70s. So that wasn't bad, but it wasn't quite as good as the older friends had managed to shoot. But it was still, I mean, this is one of the pictures which I shot before I came to Poland. I was on holiday with my parents, so I was probably 17 or 18 or something like that. And it was just a lovely landscape. But again, this landscape today is completely different. You don't get all these haystacks. It's like you have here. You see these round things in the middle of a field, whereas there in the 60s, that's what it looked like. But this is the only time I ever saw a little kid lying in a sort of homemade hammock or whatever, because I guess the parents were working in the field and they just left the baby there. But it's got a little window. You can see things and so on. It's a pity I can never meet this guy or girl or whatever it is, but I think life was under communism was bad, of course, but the people were great. For some reason, there's something in it that when you live under bad conditions, difficult conditions, you become very hardy, and it's kind of character forming to live in a country where everything is wrong, everything doesn't work, or nothing works. And you have to work out how to fight the system and how to survive in that system. And that's why I actually stayed in Poland I came in just to Poland for 3 months, 2 or 3 months, but that was 50 years ago. So I don't know how it happened, but those 3 months sort of changed my life. I wasn't doing much, I wasn't earning much, but I was getting to know a country, the country of my parents, of course. But the features I used to do was these silly features. I mean, can you imagine a monk's fire brigade? It's not often you see a monk's fire brigade, but this was in the early 70s after I arrived in Poland, and when I heard that there was a monk's fire brigade, I thought, wow, that's what the West needs, because the West, you have to remember that the Western media was different then. They used to love feature stories about nothing or about something silly or colourful. So I was doing okay with that. But can you imagine these monks? They're dressed they have sort of work habits, but they have these big belts and the axes on their sides, and they're wearing pre-war helmets, because that's all they had. That fire engine in the back is a bit old as well. But it's a great story. I went straight to Paris Match with it, and they bought it sort of on the spot. So that made me sort of realize that maybe what I was doing is okay. But anyway, it's a funny story, simply. But the Monks' Fire Brigade was necessary because that particular monastery was a publishing house. And they had wooden buildings, they had lots of paper, they had lots of ink, printing ink. So they needed, and this was before the war, Second World War. So somebody decided to build, to form a fire brigade, which started before the war, but after the war was there as well. Right now, if you go to that monastery, that fire brigade still exists, except that they look like firemen now, like your firemen, like our firemen. There's no sign that they're monks, except maybe a little sort of sign saying with a portrait of Mary or Jesus or whatever. But somebody who's being pulled out of a burning house won't actually see that, I think. This is that daily life thing. I mean, this is a question of who fell asleep first, basically. And in those days, I like sort of using long lenses, and I used to crouch in bushes not to be seen. Sort of peeping Tom type of photography. But yeah, I wonder if she'd seen me, whether she probably wouldn't see me because she's pretty old. So I don't know, maybe she wouldn't notice me. But that's what I like photographing. The funny thing is now I just use a wide-angle lens, and that's it. I don't use any long lenses, which is a bit of a shame for me because I love them. But I can't carry them, it's just too heavy. And this is, again, a picture. This is while I was still doing the daily life things. This is a picture which is about nothing, really. But I think a lot of my pictures are about nothing. Except that if you start looking into them, you can see various things. And here, I guess, it's a picture which you can decide what you want to think about it. Actually, you can give it a meaning yourself. You don't need me, actually. I don't have to have a meaning for this picture, but you might. But the idea here is that the girl is a bit too small for that big bike. Her shoelace is undone. I think it's her mother looking from the background to see if she's okay. And the energy she's putting into riding that bike or learning to ride the bike. So as I say, it's nothing important, but it makes a great picture, at least as far as I'm concerned. I was actually very fascinated by religion and religiousness in Poland because it was completely different from what I knew from London and England. The religion was simply, I mean, this was the Roman Catholic, of course, religion, but these sort of pilgrimages didn't really exist in England, whereas in Poland there were lots of these pilgrimages. This is a Good Friday pilgrimage near Krakow, in South Poland, where they actually there's a monastery there, and the priests and the monks and the villagers dress up on Good Friday and reenact the Stations of the Cross. Of course, this is either a priest or a monk or maybe a villager, but in a crown of thorns, carrying a heavy cross. And they go through all the Stations of the Cross, and it's pretty authentic. What they don't do, actually, is they don't crucify him. And this is my big problem, because what happened when they came to be crucified, he would sort of walk away and go and have a cigarette. So that sort of spoiled the fun a bit, but a good crucifixion would be good. Well, this is a Roman soldier during the same pilgrimage, and it's just so ridiculous that why not? I just love the dynamics of the young guy there who's pushing aside, feeling very important, pushing aside the crowd, and this Roman soldier wading through the mud, because of course mud makes a good picture, and Good Friday is usually usually bad weather, so snow and mud and so on is perfect. With Jesus slipping and sliding along, and the Roman soldiers doing their bit. They all feel very important, of course. Actually, like all policemen, really, and all soldiers. This is actually not quite religion, but it's what would we call it? It's an old folk custom where people say farewell winter, hello spring. They sort of make these mannequins of, for some reason, women. It's a bit unfair. Today, I'm not sure if they do. Maybe they might do a man as well. But these are, I think, made from straw or something. I think they burn them actually before they throw them in, but it's not on this picture. But they throw these two models, two mannequins, into the freezing river, and so it's spring. An interesting pilgrimage also, this is Easter, but Easter Monday in Silesia. It's a horseback pilgrimage. Everybody, the whole village, rides horses, and they all ride somewhere through the countryside around that village, which is not too good for a photographer who's on foot, because they move and we don't. But here's the parish priest, I think. Some people think it's the Polish Pope, but it's not. If it was, I'd be a rich man, but no. This is in the 80s, I think. Well, yeah, this is where the Pope comes in. And actually, this is my beginning of my work for Newsweek, because, yeah, as I say, I never tried to get into Newsweek, but I was lucky enough to be, for many years, the only Western photographer in the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union. There were people who used to fly in sometimes and shoot something for a week or two, but I was the only one who actually lived there. I guess people thought I was crazy. I could have lived a comfortable life in London, but I opted for a slightly less comfortable life in Poland. But I was in contact with Newsweek simply because as soon as the Pope was chosen in October '78, about a month later, a Newsweek journalist, I think the bureau chief of the Newsweek office in Bonn, because Bonn was the capital of Germany then, not Berlin, he came and he wanted to do a story on the illegal churches being built in Poland, because you couldn't build a church just like that. In cities, maybe you could eventually get permission, but in the countryside, the communist authorities were completely against it, and they wouldn't let you. So, but this journalist from Newsweek had heard that there were sort of illegal churches in eastern Poland by the Soviet border, and so we went down to eastern Poland and found some of these places. People would simply build a church around their house. Actually, if they had a house, they'd simply build a nave in the back garden, really, looking like a cathedral. Or another way of having a church built in a village was to build a stone or brick church in a barn, a wooden barn. Every night, the villagers would come and build it at night time. And when the brick building was finished, they knocked the wooden barn down, and suddenly there was a church standing there. And the Communist Party wouldn't touch that, because they knew that would cause trouble. So they were quite brave people, and they all had fantastic ideas of how to sort of fiddle the communist government. But after he left, and that was my first story, when it turned out that the Pope John II was going to come to Poland in July '79, he said, well, you could try and get accredited for us for the visit, and you can do some pictures for us. But he said they're sending some famous French photographer to do the main work for them. But if I want to, I can be the local guy. But the thing is, this French photographer, as soon as he saw me, he treated me like a dog, some local unknown photographer. But the thing is, I got the cover, and I got and I got most of the pictures, so he didn't do too well. But of course, I knew the ropes more than he did in terms of living in Poland. But actually, for this picture, I knew one of the monks in the monastery he was staying at. I knew one of the monks, and the monk told me that when the Pope's finished his mass, don't go back to the press center with all the rest of the foreign journalists. Just stay around for a bit, because the Pope might come out for a talk with the thousands of people there. And that's what happened. I wasn't scared of not going to the press center. I knew how to get back. I stayed, and suddenly the Pope came out, and the difference between photographing a Pope during a Mass and talking to the public is immense, because he's a different person, of course, whereas a picture of a Pope saying Mass is not photogenic. So there you are. I mean, it's a pity. You think Masses are important, but they are, but not for pictures. Yeah, this is still the Pope. It's not the Pope, but these are nuns preparing the altar for the Pope in Krakow in '79. I think the mountaineers had built the wooden structure, and the nuns, who you don't often see nuns in this position, they're simply decorating the wooden structure. But this was just before he got there, so I managed to get that. But religion really, I mean, in a way, the religion in Poland was, and maybe still is almost medieval. It's like Middle Ages. As I said, as you saw, sort of pounding through the mud and so on. It's just not very Western. I covered three papal visits, which was pretty tiring. I must say the third one I just almost gave up. Especially because after he was shot and almost killed, we were always had to stand further away. He was in this glass aquarium, bulletproof glass aquarium. We couldn't get anywhere near him. But this is him leaving Poland and Krakow at the airport just before flying off back to the Vatican. And it sort of shows the loneliness of the long-distance Pope. Now this is really my first and only exclusive. This is the beginning of the strike in Gdansk at the shipyard, in the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk. This was the second day. Not many people knew what was happening. They didn't know much what was happening. But on the first day, a guy called Michael Dobbs, who was then a British journalist working for the Sunday Times in England, but now is actually was one of the editors of the Washington Post and lives in America. But he called me and said, "Listen, something's happening in Gdansk. Do you want to come up with me?" I guess he didn't want to go with a journalist because that was competition, whereas a photographer is not competition for him. So he flew up and went to the strike. Went to the shipyard. Pretty scary because Westerners and especially photographers aren't allowed to hang around shipyards or any factory, and especially not take pictures. That's a spy. But anyway, we stood outside the gate, the famous gate, and I asked them whether they would let us in. We are Western journalists, and can you let us in? And we thought there'd be no problem. I mean, if you remember what happened afterwards, several weeks later, before the strike finished, the whole world was there. All the world's TVs, all the world's photographers, journalists, everybody was there. But on the second day, no way. They said, "Journalist? Good Lord, no, we won't let you in." Photographer? Absolutely not. Western journalist? Absolutely impossible to let you in. So it's a bit of a silly situation for journalists who sort of live from the fact that they get into places. So we hung around the shipyard gate, which for me as a photographer was I just felt uncomfortable because, as I say, you couldn't hang around with a camera outside a factory or shipyard. But I went up to them. I had a good idea. In those days I had better ideas than I do now. But I went up to them and said, "Listen, we can see something very important is happening, and maybe you should let the journalist, if you're frightened of me, let the journalist in, because he'll tell the world what's going on." And they went off and they came back half an hour later and said, "Well, okay, well, we let the journalist in, but you as a photographer, no way, you're never going to get in." So, okay, Michael went in and disappeared. And then after a while, I was getting nervous because, again, I was there with the camera and so on. It just wasn't the right place for me. So I had a good idea of telling them, "Listen, that guy doesn't speak Polish. Maybe I can come in as a translator." And they went back and they came back and they said, "Oh, well, okay, if you insist, you can go in, but absolutely no pictures." So I promised no pictures, but sometimes you break your promise. I mean, I was brought up in England where you don't break promises, but when I saw what was happening, because they led us into this hall, the famous hall where the negotiations were taking place, the guy on the left is the shipyard director. So the negotiations were between the strike committee and the shipyard itself. It wasn't the Communist Party yet. But anyway, they sat me next to a guy with a moustache. I had no idea who he was, but I sat next to him and I pretended, well, didn't so much pretend I know the language, but I'm not a very good interpreter, but I translated for Michael what more or less was going on, and I could see this guy with the moustache was very good. I mean, he could wind this director around his little finger if he wanted to. But I still had no idea who he was. But there was suddenly a break for coffee or for to go to a restroom. So this guy with the moustache disappeared, and a lot of the people disappeared. But the shipyard, the strike committee was on the right, and the director was on the left, and they were discussing, even without the guy with the moustache. And I decided I have to do that. I have to take my camera out. Is that me or not me? I have to take my camera out, and I shot a couple of pictures from behind, or these from the side, so they wouldn't see me. But of course, they must have seen me, but they didn't care. Actually, nobody ever stopped me, so I was in a way okay. So these are the first ever pictures from the shipyard strike. The only problem is that they were exclusive pictures, but Newsweek didn't know what was going on because there weren't any American agencies there. There weren't any American TV crews there. So no news was actually leaving Poland, so they didn't really know much about the strike. And the pictures were taken on a day which was difficult for me to ship to New York, to get to New York on Friday night. So they got the pictures on Saturday morning. Too late, but they could, if they'd known that something, if they had some inkling from the agencies and so on that something was going on, they could have stopped the presses and waited for my pictures. So this would be a world exclusive, but it wasn't. But anyway, I'm quite proud of that, because I was proud of the fact that I actually managed to use my brains and get in. It doesn't happen very often with me. Yeah. And that was the final day of the strike. I had to go back to ship the films after the second day. And unfortunately, my wife and son, we were planning a holiday somewhere in the south of Poland just after I got back from Gdańsk. And my wife said, "You're not going back to Gdańsk anymore. You're coming with us with a kid on vacation." And I said, well, anyway, I couldn't go back to Gdańsk, but I was itching to get back there. I even escaped from this vacation to Krakow, I think, to get a plane up to Gdańsk, but all the planes were cancelled. So I just hung my head in shame and went back to the holiday. But anyway, after we finished the holiday, I went straight up to Gdańsk, and for the last 3 days I was there, and that's when the whole world was there. Everybody, and they wouldn't believe me that they wouldn't let me in at first. But anyway, this was the final day. The agreement is signed. The guy with the moustache, it turned out, was Lech Walesa, or Wałęsa, as we call him. And the guy on his right is the party, well, one of the deputy premiers or something. So this is the important picture. Interesting, of course, that the crucifix is hanging above them, because in communist factories or anywhere you wouldn't find a crucifix, but I think this new solidarity movement, they actually fitted a cross in a crucifix. And Walesa is using this famous ballpoint pen, which is a huge red and white affair with a picture of the Black Madonna, the sacred Black Madonna inside it. And that's him telling the crowd outside that he's won this battle, not the war, but the battle is won. Afterwards, all the Western press had to follow in Walesa's footsteps. Wherever he went, we went. Because everybody was interested, the whole world was interested in this incredible guy. And he knew very well that the Western press was very important, that they would help him. I mean, it was good for him, it was good for the solidarity movement. So if you wanted to go to him, you just called him and he would let you in. There was no big problem. Right now, of course, he probably wouldn't do that, but in those days, it wasn't a problem. So I remember being, I sort of invited myself in for breakfast with him, and we decided to go after breakfast to go off to his new work as the head of the Solidarity Union. So here he's already dressed to go outside, kissing his wife goodbye. What I never knew was who that little old lady on the side was. I thought it was a nanny for his kids, because he had lots of kids. I mean, every time I was there, he had more kids for some reason. He's very, very breeding like rabbits. But after I managed to get the picture back, it came back to me after 30 years. I had no idea I'd shot that picture. And when, because after Newsweek, my pictures went off to Black Star, a New York agency. But when the New York agency was folding, they would send you back all your pictures. So I got, after 30 years, I got this picture back, had it made into a print, and somebody, I think the Polish president, saw the picture and said, listen, we have to give this picture to Walesa. And when he got the picture, his wife told me that, listen, that's my mother. So that is actually Walesa's mother-in-law in the background, in a typical mother-in-law fashion. Cup of tea, maybe a bit of tea before you go, or a sandwich before you go, and so on. The classic. And then, of course, every so often there were Solidarity organized warning strikes in various factories. This, I think, is in the Warsaw steel mill. I think it's 3 hours when they would drop their tools and do nothing and just protest all the things that are being broken or whatever. But what I liked here simply are the faces, the beautiful faces of these striking steel mill workers. You can find beautiful faces everywhere, really, if you really look. But the way we lived was this way. This is our meat shop, with no meat, of course. There's just a bit of bacon on the right. Yeah, normally there's a huge line outside any meat shop, hundreds of people waiting. But when the last people would get in, that's all they would find. Everything else was bought. But anyway, these two little old ladies came and tried to buy something, but there isn't anything to buy. But then, of course, came 1981, December the 13th, 1981. Martial law. General Jaruzelski, who was then the prime minister, imposed martial law because they were trying to stem the spread of democracy, of the democratic, not so much party, but of Solidarity and so on. They were desperate to keep in power, stay in power. So the tanks rolled in, Polish tanks, and there was Czech or Soviet tanks, but the Polish army. And it was a disaster, of course, because people just didn't know what martial law was. I mean, war is war, of course, but martial law, what does that mean? But I drove around. This is the second day of martial law, and I drove around with actually one of your best photographers, in fact, one of the world's best photographers, and certainly America's best photographer, David Burnett. He was in Warsaw then, and he was working for Time magazine. I was working for Newsweek, and we don't usually work together. Competition is competition, but we were frightened. I mean, it's not easy when there's tanks on the streets and so armed soldiers on every corner so we kept together. And there was a Polish photographer with us, and we drove around Warsaw looking for places where we could see the soldiers and so on. And I suddenly saw this thing, and obviously speaking Polish, I could understand what it said on the cinema. This is a cinema, but it's the Moscow cinema, and nobody in Poland liked Moscow. So Moscow is the important part in this thing, apart from the billboard with the name of the film, which is Apocalypse Now, which was ideal. I mean, if I hadn't thought of it, or if I had thought of it, I wouldn't have known what to make. But anyway, underneath all that is this armored personnel carrier, and so I told I was driving in this front seat or passenger seat of my car. Somebody else was driving, but we were all. I was sitting on that side, so I could always lean out of the window and shoot something, because we weren't allowed to take any photographs at the beginning of martial law. You couldn't just go out on the street with a camera; you'd get arrested straight away. So we were in the car looking for good points of view, really. But I told them. I didn't see the armored personnel carrier at the beginning. I just saw the Moscow and the Apocalypse Now, which was enough for me. That was enough of a good picture. But then we turned the corner, and I suddenly saw that there was this armored personnel carrier. But I saw it. I consider myself to be the author of this picture because I saw it because I was sitting in the front of the car. In the back, they couldn't see that. I said, let's park and try and shoot this. So we did, and we managed to find a staircase from where we could take the picture. And that became, for Poland, is one of the most iconic pictures, actually. When I die, this will be the picture which will be on my grave, probably. Which I hope isn't any time soon, of course, but you never know. But it's martial law in a nutshell. It's the Moscow, which we hated, Apocalypse Now, which describes the situation and the armored personnel carrying the soldiers. At first, of course, at the beginning of martial law, you couldn't demonstrate much because the riot police were pretty nasty, or very nasty. But this was Constitution Day, May the 3rd, and the Solidarity, which was underground, actually came out on the street to celebrate Constitution Day. But the police, the riot police, the riot Zomo police, we call the militia, they were ready and waiting with their water cannon and so on. And so I managed to get this picture, but I was pretty scared of actually being on the street in those days when those things were happening, because nobody liked photographers at that point, because a photographer in a crowd of demonstrators, they often thought you were just a secret policeman. So it's not a good position to be in for a photographer. And of course, if there was a secret policeman, which there probably was, in the crowd, he could just pull me off by the collar and take me into some doorway, dark doorway, and do whatever he wanted. And the riot police, if they saw me, they would simply try and catch me, and that would be rather painful. So luckily I had friends in various places who lived a bit higher up, and I could actually go into their apartments and photograph from windows, which is what happened here. And if you think I paid that guy down there to fly around with the flag, the Polish flag, then it's not true. I didn't pay him at all. I didn't even know him. This is the classic toilet paper thing in Poland. But normally people laugh at this picture, or the Poles, when they see it, they have a good smile on their face. But this is a sad picture, because this is outside the church where the young Pope John Paul II was born and baptized, christened. This is in the city or town of Wadowice, which is his hometown. But as soon as people heard that he'd been shot in the Vatican and almost killed, the church was full of people praying for his health. But you have to remember that toilet paper was a very, very important thing to buy. I mean, you couldn't just go and buy toilet paper. You had to be lucky and find a shop which suddenly had a supply of toilet paper, and then you had a string with you and you put it around on a string. And here it looks like a rosary, but I guess this woman didn't want to go inside the church because it's a bit embarrassing with 10 rolls of toilet paper. But I don't, and this is another picture of mine which stayed in the States for 30 years, and I was quite happy to get it back after 30 years. And I never know whether Black Star ever sold it, because for Poles it's understandable that if the Pope is injured, then you pray for him, and if you bought some toilet paper, there's no problem. But for an American, pardon me saying that, wouldn't quite realize why the toilet paper wasn't there, and why is she praying with the toilet paper in her hands. So I'm not sure if I ever sold that picture, but it's actually Polish under communism in a nutshell as well, whereas the other picture was martial law in a nutshell. This is the Polish reality in a nutshell, the sort of overly religiousness and overly religious, and the chronic lack of basic goods. One of my favorite pictures, actually, although again it's a picture out of nothing. It's actually taken during martial law, in the summer, the first summer of martial law, in the southern city of Wrocław, or Breslau as the Germans used to call it. Again, it's nothing really, but I just love the fact that he's smoking this cigarette, and again you can think what you want about this picture. You can put your own ideas into his head, why he's looking so sad, and what's he thinking about, whether his wife has just left him, or during martial law he's just lost his job or something, or maybe he's just waiting for his coffee or something. I have no idea, and you don't really care. But there is something in that sad face, and the hand holding the cigarette, and the little bit of smoke coming out of his mouth. So I've always loved this picture, because apart from all the political photography I eventually did, I've always liked my daily life pictures, and this is one of them. Another one I also like very much, and is the question of whether did she come or not. This is again in Wrocław, and he's waiting with these flowers probably for a girl, but he doesn't look too happy. Maybe she came, maybe she didn't. I didn't hang around to see. So maybe he just dumped the pictures and the flowers in that waste paper basket, and that was it. But his face and the way he looks is just sad. And again, you can think whatever you want. Everything, you had to line up for everything in Poland, whether it was meat or God knows what. Everything was. Oddly enough, this is for a fashion shop. This is for clothes. Of course, women wanted to. Usually, for women, these shops were. If you wanted to buy something, it was difficult. But again, something was probably had a shipment of nice clothes that probably arrived here. This is also Wrocław. And there's all these hundreds of people just waiting outside to buy a dress or whatever. But I remember renting a cherry picker for this picture. I wanted to drive around the city and be able to go up and down and so on, just to do things from a height. Because I'm quite tall, but I'm never tall enough. So I often have cherry pickers. But I remember it was enough for me to offer a carton of Marlboro cigarettes bought for dollars to a driver of one of these cherry pickers, and I had it for the whole day, no problem. So Marlboro was very useful. I don't smoke myself, of course, but this is when Wałęsa was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. This is on the day it happened. I immediately drove up to Gdansk to photograph him. But the interesting thing is that the pictures eventually got to New York. They were choosing various pictures. They wanted his picture on the cover. But they chose this one because they said that he looks like a cat who's just swallowed a canary. Which is a fair enough reason, of course. So I think he does look that way, basically. But the time between martial law, which finished, I think, 83, and 89, when the transformation took place, it was a depressing time. There was 6 or 7 years of total depression. Nothing worked. Solidarity was underground. You couldn't do anything, whatever. But in May 88, the Gdansk Lenin shipyard striked again, whatever the word is. They went on strike. So this is a new generation of shipyard workers, and you can tell by their faces they have no hope left. It's pretty depressing. And that's it. I mean, they're badly dressed, dirty, and sad. I mean, there was just no sign of the euphoria which took place in 1980 when the first strike happened, when people were really fighting for their rights and were elated that they won. This is Moscow. In '89, Time magazine sent me for several months to the Soviet Union. They wanted to do a special edition on. In the whole magazine was from the Soviet Union, so I was one of the leading photographers there. And I went to this place, this factory outside Moscow, where they, on an industrial level, they were building or producing Lenin statues, sort of heads or busts or statues. Enormous place, thousands of Lenin heads or even huge monuments. And the odd thing was that this was at the same time that the roundtable talks in Poland were taking place, the ones between the government and the Solidarity Union, trying to get rid of communism, whereas in Moscow nothing was happening. So the idea of Time magazine to do a big story, a big cover story on the Soviet Union was in a way misplaced, because everything that happened to change the world and rid the world of communism was happening in Poland at that very moment, and yet they were still producing Lenins. But they also had tea, of course, in this samovar. And yes, and this is what happened. This is the first Polish prime minister or premier, non-communist premier, Tadeusz Mazowiecki. This is the moment when the Polish parliament accepted his new government. And that's the look on his face then. This was probably September or something in 89. I used to follow, because I was also accredited in Moscow, I used to follow Gorbachev wherever he went. if he went on a state visit to any other country, I was there with him. Not personally, but obviously as a photographer. And this is in Prague, Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was one country in those days. But I had a very good stringer, a guy who worked for Time whenever we needed him, he'd organize things and so on. And we checked out this place outside the Royal Castle in Prague, the place where Gorbachev was supposed to come in a few hours' time. And I realized that place was completely flat. I had no way to get up I didn't have a ladder in those days. I learned my lesson. I used to travel with ladders afterwards. But this time I didn't have a ladder. So I asked Michael, that was his name, to run home and bring me a ladder, just in case, because I can't see where I'm going to stand, because when Gorbachev arrives, I'll be on the same level as he is. And so he managed to get back in time with the ladder. And I put up the ladder, climbed up on it, and as soon as Gorbachev saw a photographer on the ladder, he came straight for me. So, and this is him. But you have to remember that Gorbachev was very popular everywhere except the Soviet Union. They loved him. It was like the Beatles. The girls would squeal and so on. So that's why these outstretched hands underneath me, actually, they're almost underneath my ladder. It was quite amazing, but they didn't like him at all in the Soviet Union, but everywhere else he was really welcome. He was the only decent Soviet leader then and now especially. But this is Riga in Latvia. There's still Eastern Europe was already getting rid of communism, but Riga, Latvia was still under the clause of communism, so this was some sort of local election or something, with Lenin, of course. And this is China, of course. It's not my territory at all, although I did cover communism, so communism was my subject, but when Gorbachev went to Beijing or Peking, or whatever you want to call it, in May '89, the students on Tiananmen Square were already, hundreds of thousands of them were already protesting since April. But when they heard that Gorby was arriving, they sort of increased the power of their protests, because they wanted freedom of speech and everything else. They wanted glasnost and perestroika, what was praised by Gorby. So that's why it was quite happy at that moment. But this was when Gorbachev left, I left, and then the tanks rolled in, and there was the massacre, which I wasn't there for, which is maybe just as well. But here it was actually just still a happy affair. Very well organized. They had their own printers, they had their own clinics, they had their own little canteens or whatever. So not easy for hundreds of thousands of young people, but very, very well done. But it's actually a very, very big square. So I managed to get one of the cover. That's before the massacre. And I often wonder now, how many of the people I photographed were actually killed, because I have no way of knowing. But it's just a sad thought. East Germany. This is because the massacre occurred just when Poland was voting to form a non-communist government, which happened, of course. But and Poland was supposed to be on the front pages of all the newspapers, but at the same time, the Beijing Square, the Tiananmen Square massacre occurred. So China took over the front page, the first pages, not Poland. But in October of '89. East Germany was celebrating its 40th anniversary. So all the Warsaw Pact leaders came in, Gorbachev came in, Ceausescu, Jaruzelski, Kadar was still around then. They all flew in, a huge affair with soldiers marching and tanks rolling through, and a very, very, very fancy affair. So these are the East German soldiers marching in October '89, not realizing that in a few weeks' time their country would be almost dead, because the wall would come down. And this is actually exactly on November the 9th. The wall came down on November 9th. But this is Chancellor Kohl, West German Chancellor Kohl, was in Warsaw then. And here he is talking to our friend Wałęsa, sharing a joke. But it looks as if Wałęsa has just told him that, listen, I hear the wall's going to come down tonight. Ha, ha, ha. But they didn't know anything about that then. I didn't know anything about that then. But as soon as I came home after that, I looked at the news, and there it was. The wall had begun to fall. So this was a good joke. And that was actually very, very impressive, I must say. The euphoria in Berlin, both west and east, it was like the Pope's visit, the first Pope's visit in Poland. Really, really incredible. The only problem, of course, for Poland is that the whole world thinks that it's Germany who managed to get rid of the communists because the wall came down as very, very photogenic, very visual, whereas in fact it was the Poles who many years before had started the hard work of grinding down communism. But it wasn't quite as spectacular as this. So because this was spectacular, the world thinks it was Germany who finished the reign of communism in Europe. But it's a bit sad because it wasn't them, it was us. But what is nice is working for Time magazine, I never had time to wait for the weather. Whatever the weather, you had to shoot, whether it was pouring with rain or just no sun, no light. But here I was lucky, the sun was perfect. Yeah, and that really was an incredible affair, actually. Visually fantastic. And what's nice, one of these guys standing there, I think next to the one in white, he's a German guy, I think a German punk rock star or whoever, managed to find me somehow and say it's him, that's me on the cover. Which is always nice, actually, because I photograph people completely anonymously, but if somebody says it's them, I believe them. After Germany, it was the turn of Czechoslovakia. So this is in Wenceslas Square in Czechoslovakia. This is actually, whereas in Poland and so on, it was mostly workers and intellectuals who took part in demos, whereas in Czechoslovakia, it was young people, students and so on. And these kids wanted a government with clean hands. That's why they hold their palms up. They just want to get rid of these terrible people and have people who have clean hands run their country. This was Bulgaria. This is, again, but that was just one big demo and it all went. But this is perhaps a photograph for dentists. Of course, it probably was. I think she opened beer bottles with her teeth, which is quite possible. This is the last one that happened. This is the portrait of a dictator. This is the grave of Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania. They shot him over Christmas in '89, executed him and his wife, but they buried him on a path. This is not a place for a grave. It's a path, an unmarked grave, so people could walk over him. They hated him so much they just wanted a completely anonymous grave in a path, so anybody who was there could walk over his grave. And his wife was in a slightly different place, but also unmarked. Now we come to today's, the last 8 years, of course, Poland, for some reason, had a government, a right-wing nationalist government, which, in a way, most of the Poles wanted to get rid of as soon as possible because they were sort of demolishing everything, deconstructing the Polish state in a way. But especially the rule of law. This is outside the Supreme Court in Warsaw. They held this sort of candlelit vigil outside, and the sign upstairs, up top, which was projected onto the top, was this is our court, as opposed to their court. But it was it was 8 years of fight, really, which I didn't have to do, actually. I didn't have to cover it because I was no longer working for any magazines or any media. But because I'd covered Poland for so long, and Eastern Europe, and considered myself what I call now a visual historian, I thought, well, if I've been working on Poland's history for so many years, that I have to carry on with, just for myself, for my own archives. So I did. These are women protesting for women's rights, really, for abortion rights and just rights for women. They used to block streets. It wasn't violent, but it looks pretty authentic. This is a woman being arrested, being stopped apprehended by police, just by shouting the words "Lech Walesa," and the police just jumped on her. This was during the days of the Law and Justice Party. But for me, as far as I'm concerned, what was interesting was that I could actually photograph this, because under communism, I couldn't get anywhere near a policeman or a riot policeman and photograph him just like that. I'd be arrested or beaten up straight away. Whereas here, as bad as the Law and Justice Party was, you could at least approach a policeman in action, and they wouldn't, unless something really bad was happening, they wouldn't. They might not like being photographed, but they wouldn't actually stop you. So this was one big change, which is carrying on now, of course, with the new democratic government. This is still the anti-law and justice for women's rights. And there was a huge march they called it the March of the Thousand Togas. It was all the lawyers and judges and so on marched from the Supreme Court to the Parliament building, because they'd been taped shut, really. They couldn't do a lot of things which the Law and Justice Party just didn't want to allow them to do. So that's just a way of showing their fight for democracy. Same with the rights of LGBT and so on. It happens now. I mean, before it was, at least in communist days, you wouldn't see that, but nowadays you do. What I do like about this is this guy did a wonderful hat, made a wonderful hat similar to the Palace of Culture, which most Poles hate because it was built, it was a present from Stalin to Poland in the 50s. But this young guy did a pretty good job. Of course, and then we're getting almost finished. This is, of course, the Ukrainian refugees arriving just after the war started, after the Soviet Union, Russia. I always call it the Soviet Union because it's the same thing for me. It's just the same, or just as bad as it was. But when they attacked and invaded Ukraine, and thousands of Ukrainians suddenly jumped in trains or whatever and ended up at Warsaw Central Station, and before they could do anything else, they just fell asleep, completely tired and frightened. But the Poles were very, very good. It wasn't so much the government that did much, but it was simply the Polish citizens, Warsaw citizens, other cities. They set up stands for these people, thousands of them, telling them where they can go and find a night's sleep, or which town they should go to if they really want to live somewhere else. They gave them food, lodging, and it was actually fantastic. But as I say, it was the people. It was the people's initiative. But when the invasion, after the Russians invaded, this was outside the Russian embassy. And this is the Russian embassy. And this was these young Polish people who, when they'd heard of the massacre in Bucha, they immediately went to the Russian embassy and they lay down. They staged this event, of course. They lay down with their hands tied behind their backs and plastic bags over their heads, like the people who were massacred they were shot that way in Bucha. And this is what happened outside the embassy. I think that's the last picture. Goodness. Yeah, that's the last picture. That's all I have for you today. See you. Yeah. Goodness. Barely. Oh dear. 1 second. Bear with me for another hour or so. Yes. Fantastic. Okay, thanks.
So,
Yes, I'll sit somewhere here. My goodness. It's nice to meet you.
Thank you,
and,
Chris.
I hope we
Yes.
get a good talk in here.
well, that was fantastic. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to see your pictures and hear some of your stories. We've got a few minutes for questions in our conversation, and
There you are. It's not often.
I'll be on the screen next month.
Yeah.
So I really liked how you describe yourself as a visual historian. That's something I've read that you've used before, and you used that tonight. And I think that works very well to describe your work. And I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit about why you think visual images are so important for history.
Well, I think that right now the attention span of people, especially young people, is so low, so short that the pictures are much easier to read than reading magazines even or serious history text or whatever. So I think these pictures, and especially because they're in color and good color, because this was Kodak color or Fuji later on. That's why they survived. If this was East German film, there wouldn't be any work, but any photos left. But I think for young people, especially in Poland, of course, where the young people have lived with their parents, who have often told them what life was like under communism. But they sort of listen with one ear and comes out of the other ear, and they weren't too interested. But now they can, if they see these at an exhibition, which happened in Warsaw, they are actually very interested because they can see what their parents were talking about, and it doesn't mean much work for them. They just go in and have a look, and that's they can actually see what their parents were told or grandparents told them what life was like in the old days. So that's where the form of visual history comes in. It might sound a bit big-headed, but I think that's what it is really. But what else can you call it? I mean, I've often been asked, what's the difference between photojournalism and documentary photography, and that usually throws me because I'm not sure what to say. But I've come to the conclusion that it's a question of 30 or 40 years. That once you've shot something 40 years ago, it's photojournalism, but after 40 years, it's a document. It shows us how we looked, how we dressed, how we wore our hair, what cars we drove if we had a car. How we lived and how the cities looked. So that's in a way, that's history, and it's visual, so why not?
Well, as I mentioned to you, for me, it's a bit of a time capsule. I was fortunate enough to visit Poland for 2 weeks in 1984 during martial law when I was a college student. And seeing your photographs, it was almost like it transported me back there. I could almost smell what it was like. I could almost smell the coal burning in the streets. I could hear the horses walking, carrying the cart, or the silence of the empty stores.
Yeah,
there's
also a sound and a smell. Because the shops they smelt not too well. They didn't look good. For some reason, communism was always a negative form of whatever expression. Everything, if they built a shop, they built it badly. They furnished it badly. They supplied it badly. Everything was bad, really. But you were there at an interesting time because that's precisely the depressing years between martial law and the transformation in '89.
You know, really felt when we were there that we were almost doing something subversive, just talking to people and meeting people, just doing that. And it's hard to explain what that experience was like, but your photographs, I think, helped bring that out a little bit. Some of the portraits of, the gentleman at the cafe, but then also the workers. You could see that in people's faces.
But that's what's nice about photography, that you can actually photograph people, and that's why the law nowadays is completely against that. You can't photograph somebody, just one face in the crowd. You can photograph, say, 7 or 8 people, and then publish it. But you're not allowed to photograph a private face, which I find ridiculous, completely wrong, and it's killing photography, street photography, because it's those single faces which are the best. Because if you've seen that single face and you know why you're photographing it, well, that's why you're photographing it. That's because it's an interesting face.
Well, in the woman at the protest that you saw just like 3 slides before this, her face was so expressive and so
Precisely.
powerful.
Hard not to be expressive when your country's just been invaded, yeah.
Yeah. Well, maybe you could talk a bit about your experience in Poland. Your migration pattern, I think, was a little bit unconventional. In the early 70s, there were not a lot of people moving to Poland, but you chose to do that, and it was really then foundational for your career. And I'm curious, it's a bit of a hypothetical, but what would your career have been like if you had remained in England? In other words, could you talk a bit about the importance of Poland to your development as a photographer?
Well, it's 100% importance, because if I stayed in England, what would I be doing? I'd probably be doing silly features, really, which is what I was fairly good at when I finished my studies and so on. But obviously interesting things were happening in England then in the early 70s, because the coal mines are being shut, so maybe I'd have got into that somehow, but I just didn't feel it. And I came to Poland, but the thing is that everybody was trying to escape Poland. All my friends were trying to get out, and they thought I was a UFO or something, an idiot guy who was trying to get in, whereas they were trying to get out. But of course, I had a British passport and Western currency, so I could live fairly comfortably. But I could also leave the country if I really had to, which I didn't.
What was it like for you? Well, you've described it as an advantage, being a foreign journalist in Poland. Could you describe how it was an advantage for you?
Well, simply being accredited in Poland, which I was the only photographer accredited as a Western journalist by the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So I was one of just one person really. They'd never had a person like me. They thought I was mad probably as well. But I have no idea what they thought. But it was useful in the sense that, especially once I started working for Newsweek or Time, which took a bit of, it was after a few years, it opened doors. I mean, these magazines, the Poles loved them. They never got them. They could never see them, or very rarely. But they tried to buy them or tried to read them at friends or whatever, so they knew what these magazines were. And so they thought it was very important to be able to be a Newsweek photographer or a Time photographer, which was always important for everybody, important here as well. But under a communist government, it was even more important. Yeah, it was just it opened doors, put it that way. One privilege we had, which I found very, very bad, was, and at first I wouldn't take advantage of it, was that we received passes for a diplomatic meat shop in Warsaw, which was only for diplomats.
Which is not the one you photographed.
No. It's true. I never photographed that one. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't easy to go into a shop and photograph anything, so I'm not quite sure how I did these pictures. But this meat shop, you could go in there. There were quite a lot of people usually, but all diplomats or staff people who worked for the diplomats, and you could buy as much as you wanted of everything you wanted. Whole ham, 3 of these please, or whatever. Everything was but at first I just wouldn't go there. I thought I was just too embarrassed to have this luxury. And as a single guy, I didn't need it really. But when I got married and had a family and friends and so on, I decided, well, maybe it's time to help them, because they couldn't get much at all. Meat was rationed. So I was a godsend to many people. So I actually was a useful guy. People liked me. Yeah.
You've described, and I like this a lot, that working under communism was interesting because it was visually interesting. That photography became visually interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could you explain what you mean by that?
I've no idea. But everything was just, if you looked left, you could see something daft, or is abstract or absurd. Or if you looked that way, it was the same. If you looked there, it was the same. If you looked back, everything was upside down. It was just absurd situations, whether it was just people waiting in line for something, which is not really absurd. It's just a sad thing. But it's something I wouldn't see in London, simply. So for me, as a foreigner, as I was then, it was just a fascinating thing to see. So yes, communism was fantastic for photography. I always tell Poles that I lived off communism, really. Basically, if communism hadn't been there, what would I be doing? So when communism fell, this was my problem, of course. What was going to happen to me? And I immediately realized when I was standing under the Berlin Wall, I felt as if the rug had been pulled out from under my feet. That, what am I going to do now? It's all over. So I'm a very poor man now. Yeah.
Well, it is true that it seems like your career was really focused in the 70s and 80s in
Yes.
Eastern Europe.
Yes,
And then,
yes.
did you work in photography after 1990?
I eventually had trouble with that, actually, because I worked for a few more years for Time magazine, but the stories were no longer interesting. My stories were the great sort of anti-communist stories, whereas in the 90s, they were just sort of business stories, which didn't fascinate me at all. As somebody was, I forget now, but it was just not interesting for me. So in a way, I wasn't interested in Time. Didn't really need a photographer here anymore because technology had changed. They could actually call some photographer in Czechoslovakia or Bulgaria and ask them, can you shoot this and that and ship it over, and they could do that now. Because before only I could do that, or any accredited photographer could do that. Shipping meant that we used to ship undeveloped films. We went to the cargo terminal at an airport and put the packet onto a plane as cargo, which will get to New York by Friday, hopefully. And before only I could do that, or somebody like me. Whereas afterwards anybody could somehow. And then when transmitting pictures was possible through computers or even from a camera, then I was completely unnecessary. But I had my good years, so I can't complain.
Well, and it looks like you're still taking very interesting.
Yeah, but that's in my house. That's in my archives.
Well,
Which I have no idea what I have actually, because everything came back to me eventually. But after a while, I never had time to look at what I'd shot. And the only thing I ever saw, if something was published, there'd be one picture out of 2,000 or whatever. So it was all lying in boxes for years in my house. And then I found a girl who could actually do something with it, and because my wife said that if I die, she's going to throw it all out. It was just in the basement, there were all these boxes and boxes and boxes, and I never had time to look at them. So I found a girl, luckily a girl, not a boy. I mean, this is interesting, of course, but she was very good. She is very good, and she simply catalogs everything, but she knows what's there, not me.
Well, as perhaps you know, this building we're very committed to archives, so please hold on to them.
Next week, then.
So I understand our time is running out, but I want to make sure we've got time for a few questions from the audience. So
Yes.
if we could lift up the lights a little bit. Yes.
My question is, have you ever taken a photograph that then your camera was confiscated or destroyed because you took that photograph?
My camera was confiscated because somebody else took that photograph, which I couldn't do. I smuggled the camera to a Polish photographer who was allowed to be at some negotiations between the government and Solidarity. And he tried, but the secret police or whoever realized that he was shooting somebody else's camera, and they confiscated it. And they contacted me and were very nice and said, listen, if you shoot pictures for us sometimes when there's a demo or something, you're a much better photographer than we are. So if you just hand us over some of your prints of the people who are demonstrating, then we'll give you a camera back. But I said, you keep the camera, and I won't give you anything. Because for me, I could say that quite luckily, because I was a foreign national and I was earning dollars. So a camera body or a camera lens was a day's work, really, or maybe 2 days' work. But if I'd been a Polish photographer, that would be the big problem, because for him to buy, or her to buy, a Western camera and so on, it was murder. I mean, that was impossible, almost impossible to buy. So I could laugh and say, keep it, no problem, but you're not getting any pictures from me. What they didn't realize, of course, was that my pictures they couldn't get because they were sent undeveloped. So I never saw them myself. So that was the only time when they tried to be nice to me.
Were you shooting slides at that time?
Everything slides. All
So
the
you never saw, so you were shooting slides, which is so exacting, and you never got to look at your acting.
yes.
So when you would send that, would you send, you know, picture A is, you know, or 1 to 36, would you tell the story of what you were working through
I think I was more well known in both Newsweek and Time for my captions than for my pictures, because I was one of the few photographers who actually wrote what I was shooting, because I knew very well that a picture editor in New York actually had no idea what was coming in, and he had a few hours to look through everything, and they decide what to print. So I think I was quite good at writing everything, but also including if I was pushing the film, meaning a higher rating of ISO or ASA, to make them more sensitive, then I had to write that and say whether it's color negative or color slide, but usually color, almost always color slide. But you're right, it's very exacting.
Well, and that means you had a notepad with you all the time.
No, don't think so.
Remembering all of it?
Brains, you know, brains. Yeah. No, I don't know. I can't remember a thing. But both Time and Newsweek had these little card envelopes where you had to write everything on. But if I had those with me when I was shooting, I can't remember. No, I think I just remembered whatever.
We've got time for one more question, and then there will be a reception afterwards. Yes, toward in the back.
I think what can be sometimes underexplored is that the economic shift that occurred was not immediate, and so that the 1990s were also a fairly economically difficult time. Could you give some of your reflections on that if you were in Poland in the 90s at the time?
If I heard that, that would be easier to answer.
In the 90s, it was still a very difficult economic time. Things did not transition at that point. Did you witness that?
Yeah, I think, yes, you could see very well, because inflation was terrible in Poland. Luckily, we had this economist, Leszek Balcerowicz, who people hated, and especially taxi drivers hated for some reason. Don't know why, but he really went for inflation in a big way, but in a way he caused the inflation, which he then tried to cure, which he did. But it was very difficult for most people to make ends meet, because inflation was, you know, 100% a week or a month. God, it was terrible. So people could hardly live and make ends meet. But that's when people started becoming very clever, and they had these camp beds which they'd fold out on the street and sell whatever they could sell. Because things were available at that. So oddly enough, as soon as communism fell, you could actually buy things. And they would buy them cheap somewhere and put them out on these camp beds in the middle of the street. Whole streets were full of these camp beds and so on. And so they were very clever, actually. And those people made ends meet. And of course, they made everything available. So you could buy things, so you just couldn't afford them, really, which is a bit like nowadays, I guess.
Well, my understanding is that you'll have a chance to meet the photographer at a reception afterwards. Please join me in thanking our distinguished visitor tonight.
What do you call it? The the Round Rock, yes, Round Rock Public Library, where my exhibition is there. I mean, there's lots of pictures there. It's hanging up in the library on the 3rd floor. And if you really want to see my pictures, that's where. Here, this was just part of it. I think it'll be there for a month or so. But please go there and have a look. It's not too bad, actually.